All right, y'all, it is 9:42. I think we're going to go ahead and get started. Just a couple housekeeping things before I turn it over to our guest presenters. This is our last summer adult forum for this summer. We've had, it's been really rich despite having to do it in this virtual setting. So I'm grateful for those of you especially who have been our faithful every Sunday coming out for these. We will be turning to our fall programming starting on August 23rd. But next week, in lieu of what would typically be our rally day and our day for an adult ministry fair, we are going to do that virtually. So if you come at the same time next Sunday, you'll get to hear about all that we have planned for adult formation in the fall. That'll include classes that are happening midweek as well as on Sunday morning. We do have fewer classes that are meeting for Sunday school in the fall because of the pandemic and just the challenges that are posed doing this online. But what we do have planned is really, it's really deep and I'm excited about it. So I hope that y'all will come and hear everything that we have planned next Sunday at 9:40. But turning to the order of this morning, I am excited to introduce Matt Seltzer and Dr. David Rupke. Dr. Rupke is the Associate Professor for Physics and Astronomy at Rhodes College, and Matt Seltzer is an architect here in Memphis. He's also the son-in-law of Jim Lavernier. Jim, wave to us. And we found that we actually have a lot of fun sort of Episcopalian Presbyterian connections. They're both members at Calvary Episcopal Church just down the street. It's a church that we've had a partnership with on a number of things just over the years. So we're excited that they are here with us this morning to talk to us about climate change. I imagine they will tell you a little bit more about their partnership doing this work and why they feel called to do it. But before I turn it over to them, I would invite you all to join me in an opening prayer. Please pray with me. God, for the gift of waking to the brightness of this new day, we give you thanks. For the gift of this time together and for Matt and David and their leadership, we give you thanks. For the gift of gathering us with hearts and minds open to learn, to be challenged, to be formed as people who respond to your amazing grace. We give you thanks. For this earth that we all call home, for its beauty and diversity and abundance that is ours to enjoy and protect, we give you thanks. God, make your presence known here in this hour of formation. In Christ's name we pray. Amen. All right, David and Matt, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Well, thank you, Sarah. And I'll start. Maybe I'll just start by saying we're happy to be here. We're grateful that you all are here. I know that your community has been through a lot in the last couple of weeks, and my family and certainly the Calvary community, I'm sure I can speak for them, that we have been praying for you and for Steve's family. So thank you for coming in the midst of all that to talk about these other important things. seem overshadowed by a lot of things in today's world, both personal and communal, but still things that we can all think about and pray about together. So I'm going to share a screen here with a presentation that Matt and I have. So we actually started with a prayer, but Sarah's prayer was so lovely that I'm just going to skip that and go straight into talking a little bit. Matt and I are going to talk first a little bit about our journeys into thinking about these things and wanting to talk to churches about them. So I am, as Sarah mentioned, I'm a professor of physics and astronomy, and I teach, I'm an astronomer by research, and so I teach a lot of the astronomy classes at Rhodes. And in particular, I teach astronomy to undergraduates. And a few years ago, I started including a unit on climate change in that course when teaching about planets. This isn't the first time that climate change has been taught at Rhodes. I know that some of my predecessors there taught about these things even back in the 90s. So this is something that folks have been aware of for decades, but it's definitely something that's at the forefront of consciousness now. And I started teaching it to students in my class because I felt like it was important enough that students should be exposed to it at some point in college. I want to start actually by asking, and I would invite any of you you can put your answer in the chat window or just say it out. What is the planet nearest to the sun? And so you can either just tell us verbally or you can chat with us if you want. All right, Jeremy Sykes says Mercury. That is correct. All right, excellent, you learned something back in the day. So my next question then is, if Mercury is the planet that is nearest to the sun, what is the hottest planet? So Mercury is the planet that is nearest to the sun. What is the hottest planet? And again, you can speak the answer if you want, or just type it in. All right, and I see Jeremy has done his homework. So Venus is actually the hottest planet. Mercury is nearest to the sun. Mercury, Venus, you can all say it with me, Earth, Mars, and so on. So Venus, even though it's further from the sun, is hotter. And the reason that Venus is hotter is because, in fact, it's very hot. If you were to try to live on Venus, you would not be able to because it's so hot. And the reason for that is that its atmosphere is almost completely made of carbon dioxide. So carbon dioxide is the best known greenhouse gas. Greenhouse gases, primarily carbon dioxide, but also methane, nitrous oxide, which comes from a variety of processes, but including agricultural production. A human-made substance called hydrofluorocarbons, and actually water is a greenhouse gas. So these gases serve as a blanket that warms the Earth. And this is actually a really good thing. So on Earth, we also have greenhouse gases, which keeps us above freezing. So if the Earth didn't have these greenhouse gases, life couldn't exist. But if we get too many, like on Venus, then it's just too darn hot. How does this work? Well, in short, these greenhouse gases absorb something called infrared radiation. So infrared radiation is a form of light that you can't see, but it's actually a radiation that you, as a human body, emit. So if you were to look at yourself or look at the person next to you in infrared light, you would see that they're glowing. And that's because they have a temperature. They're a particular temperature, and everything that has a temperature emits infrared radiation. So the Earth emits infrared radiation, the atmosphere emits infrared radiation, and they also absorb these.
Excuse me, are you showing different slides?
Just one.
I'm sorry, go ahead.
I only see one slide. Is that what you're showing?
That is the slide I'm showing, yep. Mm-hmm.
With a little blue.
So the reason I'm showing this slide, this is a little slice of the atmosphere, right?
Oh, okay.
I like showing this because it kind of illustrates that, you know, this little bit of atmosphere, this blanket, is what protects us, right, from the cosmos. It's what kind of keeps us warm, keeps us alive. So it's really important. And these little constituents, greenhouse gases, are what do that work in the atmosphere. So that's the sort of the bit of science that I'm talking about. So I want to ask another question. So this infrared radiation that comes in, that gets absorbed by greenhouse gases, and that kind of keeps the Earth a little warmer than it would be otherwise. I want you now to think of the energy that enters the Earth's atmosphere from the sun. I want to ask you how much of that energy ends up going out. So think of all the energy coming in from the sun that keeps us alive, that keeps life going on Earth. How much of that goes back out into space? Any ideas or thoughts? So Jonathan Jones says none of it goes back into space. It all stays on Earth. Okay. Any other answers or thoughts?
I think the dog said 3 barks, which is 30%.
Yeah, sorry, my our dog is a little barky this morning. The joys of Zoom. Any other answers besides 0? Okay. So normally we would have a discussion about these things, and I could facilitate that, but I think we'll keep it a little simpler this morning. So the correct answer actually is 100% of that energy ends up going back out. So all the energy that comes into the Earth, 100% of it needs to go back out. What would happen if we retained, let's say none of it went back out and we just kept getting energy from the sun? What do you think would happen?
We would burn up.
We would burn up, exactly. So that would be a bad thing. So it's actually good that 100% of that energy goes back out, right? But, right, we can get into an imbalance, okay? So for instance, if we put too many greenhouse gases in the atmosphere, then that puts the system out of equilibrium, out of balance. And if that happens, then for a little while, we're going to absorb, we're going to keep a little bit less than, we're going to emit a little bit less than 100% of that energy, okay? So we're going to save just a small fraction of that energy. And what that's going to do is it's going to warm the planet. And eventually we'll get back into equilibrium, right? So that energy in equals energy out. But in the meantime, you know, there's going to be some movement in that seesaw. Okay. So that's the greenhouse effect. The extra greenhouse gases are throwing the atmosphere and the Earth out of equilibrium. So the energy out is actually slightly smaller than the energy in. All right, so that's just the very basic primer to the greenhouse effect. But it's a pretty simple thing in a lot of ways, considering all the debate that surrounds this. So why did I get into this? And then I'll let Matt talk. You know, as I mentioned, I think it's important for my students to know it, but why are we talking to you all? Well, it's pretty clear that we have a lot of work to do as people, and that our children and grandchildren will have more work to do if we don't do the work. So that's in short why we're having this conversation this morning. All right, Matt, I'll hand it over to you, and I'm going to advance the slides.
So Dave's a physicist and an astronomer, and I'm an architect. And so in thinking about how we both arrived at wanting to talk more about this to more people, just wanted to spend a little bit of time talking about a personal approach to this. Dave talked about the greenhouse gas, and Dave talked about how science and the planet and the cosmos are sort of interrelated. And how I arrived at sort of a personal choice to try to understand this better was I started looking at what I did for a living. And even though I loved it, some time ago, in the last 10 years, I started to realize that that what I did was part of the problem. And you see some graphs here. These are a couple years old, but essentially, if you look at the warm colored pieces of the pie, this is global carbon dioxide emissions by sort of industrial sector. Okay, if you look at the upper right hand side of the pie there, you can see that building materials and construction are 11% of global CO2 emissions, and building operations are 28%. So over a third of the carbon dioxide emissions on the planet are given to the earth by essentially making and running buildings, which means that what I do every day is I go to work and I make money assaulting the planet. This is what I said to myself when I realized that this was a problem for me. And so if you look here at the bottom, the important thing there, the white line is sort of where we were in 2018 of trillions of square feet. And so now if you project this line forward, we're going to keep building. And as we keep building, we're starting to add the equivalent of several New York cities worth of real estate here. And as we add that real estate to the planet, we're going to add to that pie up above. And so the way that I started to understand it is, if I didn't start to change how I approached what I did at my job, I was doing bad things. And so it was really just a personal realization that I needed to change sort of at least understanding about what I paid attention to and what I cared about at work in order to try to reconcile what I thought was a good thing to do and how I think I should be continuing doing that. So while Dave approached this, from a scientific perspective and the concern for the planet based on what he understands these things, my approach was more of a personal, I'm not going to say a crisis, but a personal realization that my faith and my vocation were, if I didn't try to understand things a little bit better, could potentially be at odds. And so if we go to the next slide, I think the merging with all this is Dave and I met at Calvary, and through a series of casual conversations, we started to realize that both of us felt like our vocation and our spiritual obligation sort of required us to try to talk about it more. And then we figured that the easiest way to go about doing this was to try to talk to as many people as possible and try to learn more in the process. And so that's why we're here. And so that kind of leads us to this conversation, which is a little bit about climate change, but also what we can do about climate change. So in thinking about this, Dave and I both approached it here, and then here we have sort of this postcard from the land of concern. And Dave can talk a little bit more about this, but essentially when it gets down to it, and when it gets down to human intervention in terms of climate change and the problem, what we're really trying to do at a very, very simple level, whether it's from a scientific or other or building process, is we're trying to curb our addiction and use of fossil fuels and minimize and mitigate our planet's human carbon footprint. And Dave can talk a little bit more about this, but the rest of the things that we're going to be talking about are what we can do as people, and in this case, as spiritual people, to try to work at many different levels to try to help fight this idea about climate change.
Yeah, so I'll jump in there again and just, I mean, I think Matt introduced this idea of the carbon footprint. And scientists have a lot of ways to measure how we impact the Earth's temperature, which is, sort of the zeroth, kind of the simplest thing that you can boil it down to. But there are so many other effects. So the Earth is a complex and beautiful system that God has given us, that is very robust, but it's also, there are so many ways that we can, affect the beings that live on the Earth. And in particular, this seemingly small thing of changing the greenhouse gas content of the atmosphere has enormous knock-on effects. So we're all kind of intertwined here on the Earth. But boiling it again down to, the temperature and then how we affect that from this carbon footprint, the idea is that when we add these greenhouse gases, we can sort of think of that as, all the things that go into, what are the equivalents of adding carbon dioxide, even if it's not carbon dioxide. So for instance, methane and hydrofluorocarbons that I mentioned are also important. So it's not just carbon dioxide, but that's kind of what we can kind of think of, what's the sort of the equivalent carbon dioxide effect of the things that we do. And we could spend a lot of time on that, but I think we want to move on to thinking about what can we do. So spending a little less time now on what it is and thinking again about what we can do. And we've kind of organized this sort of moving from kind of larger spheres to smaller spheres. And we're just gonna kind of walk through some of these, but we invite questions and ideas or thoughts, discussion, if you all have anything. Maybe I'll just stop here briefly and say, before we move on, do you guys have any questions about some of the things we've said? And feel free to just jump in verbally with a question, or if you want to type something into the chat window.
This is Peggy McClure. What would you say the percentage is of, if you can even venture a guess, what would you say the percentage is of architects these days who are thinking more in this vein of thought than in the past has been? I mean, is it exponentially growing that people are thinking more about their impact on the global climate with architecture?
Sure. I would say both the architecture and construction industry over the past, especially 5 years, have become more than aware. 10 years for sure, but the past 5 years have been really huge. The issue, though, is that, I can be concerned and I can be aware and I can do what I need to do in order to prepare myself, in order to fundamentally understand, our role, and I can counsel anyone, including a contractor or an owner or someone else. But eventually, the bigger issue is I get hired by someone that has a budget to do certain things, and I can try to help that person make good business and decisions relative to the environment. But if there is a less expensive option for someone to choose that involves using fossil fuel and they elect to do it, I may have helped, but I didn't necessarily solve the problem. So part of the reckoning that we have to do is really fight to try to change the supply chain by changing the demand of the planet. And so if you're going to go renovate your house, or if you're going to build a new building, the problem isn't just architects and contractors, it's the people that are paying us money. And people need to understand that there are certain long-term investments, strategic investments they make. They might pay more now in order to have the planet pay less later. Does that make sense, Peggy?
Yes, thank you.
That's sort of where we are. And there's another question here. Frame the challenge to human interaction to climate change about curbing our addiction to use of fossil fuels. And the fossil fuels are the most direct link from human culture to greenhouse gases. Okay, so when we say curb and mitigate fossil fuels and the resultant carbon footprint, is what I said, both of those things are intertwined. So if you just think about it in terms of humans and fossil fuels, that's the best way to say I'm going to reduce my own carbon footprint, is by reducing how you interact with fossil fuels. It's really just, you can make it that simple. And if you at least take it from that standpoint, it really can help you understand the linkages between fossil fuels and everything that we do right now.
Which is deep. So, you know, simple things can trace, you know, you can trace back to fossil fuels at some point, things that you might think are unconnected in a very direct way. There's a question now about power production. We're actually going to come to that in just a minute, so let me hold on that question.
Yeah, Jeremy, we have we can talk a little bit more about that, but right now it's somewhere between building and industry, but also there's an automotive or transportation, and realize that the emissions, the crazy thing about it is, and what we're talking about is the fossil fuel impact in that entire pie chart has some relationship. Every single piece of that pie has some trace that goes back to fossil fuel emissions. That's what's crazy about it. If you're a human and you're existing in an inside room right now, everywhere around you is embodied carbon that was brought to you courtesy of fossil fuels. Everything. Everything. It's the whole pie. The whole pie. So I hope you're hungry.
All right, so kind of looking at the big picture, the national and international picture. International cooperation is essential. I don't know that we hear about that a lot. There have been these international climate conferences for decades now, but these are essential because of the rebound effect. So, you know, we can make things better in our sphere, and we have to, but if the result is that those carbon emissions just get moved somewhere else, then we haven't accomplished what we need to. So that international cooperation is essential. But on a national level, we have to come together and agree that this is a problem. This particular slide is just one example of a national organization that's working towards a climate solution. I know that the politics of this are extremely complicated, but this is the Citizens Climate Lobby is a bipartisan or a nonpartisan group that's trying to get something, basically a carbon fee and dividend passed. It's a particular way of doing it that returns profits to citizens. I'm not necessarily advocating for this particular group, although I think it's a great group, and there's a new Memphis chapter which you can go and join. The Memphis chapter of Citizens Climate Lobby. I know the bill that they put before Congress, Steve Cohen is a co-sponsor. So I think that, you know, we do need legislation, but we also need a national conversation and a national conversion in a lot of ways to understand that this is really a problem. So the voting booth and all the other political levers that we can pull are essential and critical. On the state and regional level, maybe I'll pass this one to you, Matt. I mean, this has been a lot in the news, actually. So let me let you talk about this one, Matt.
Sure. So recently in the news, as recently as this past week, articles in the Daily Memphian, everyone knows that MLG&W is sort of shopping for competitive provider because the TVA contract with MLG&W is up. And there's two competing organizations. TVA is fighting to get a renewal of their contract, and another is another acronym called MISO, which sounds yummier, honestly, but it has its own special sort of the way it brings power to Memphis. And so I would talk about that in a minute, but this pie chart is essentially TVA's plan for how to reduce carbon emissions in its power generation portfolio. You can see in 2007 that hydroelectric and nuclear power generated 32% of the overall portfolio, but gas and coal, both direct fossil fuel materials, generated the majority of the portfolio. In 2020, in this year, they're delivering slightly less energy, 163 terawatt hours, but 56% of it is carbon free. Noting that a large chunk of that is nuclear power, and then there's a small piece of the pie there with wind and solar, and then hydroelectric power has been increased. And you see gas has been increased and coal has been greatly reduced. Now, we can all agree that this is progress, specifically for a 13-year progress. It's pretty good. But what's incredible about it is if you can make this much progress in 13 years, look at what they have projected for their 10-year plan, which is to go from 56% carbon free this year to 10 years from now going to 61% carbon free. And so although it is nice to see that someone has a plan, every time I look at this graph, I would suggest to you that it's disappointing. And it goes back to this same comment relative to Peggy's comment that what's interesting about all of this is you can want to change what people are doing, but we, just like we have had a very hard time in this country keeping each other safe from things like infection, because it sort of goes against the very grain of our personal liberties, or at least how we feel about our personal liberties. This conversation about how comfortable or what the stomach is for being able to have renewable energy goes straight to the pocketbook. And when that happens, everyone's desire to save the planet drops off precipitously as soon as it starts to affect how expensive your stuff is. And the other problem with this, of course, is that each of these organizations is trying to keep power to our house to be relatively affordable within the marketplace. And I say that meaning we still want the poor people in our community to have power too. So although this needs to be more aggressive in my mind, we do need to have a balancing act where we make sure that all of our folks get access to power at an affordable rate. So when you see these conversations between TVA and MISO and how much they're saving, how much money people are saving, just realize that it's not necessary. The discussion about money is part of our problem. The discussion doesn't need to be about money. The discussion needs to be about value and how we can keep serving even the poorest of people with the least amount of carbon impact as we move forward. And it's not really getting covered that way because everyone wants to talk about money. So at a state and regional level, thinking about power and thinking about how we get power and thinking about access to more renewable forms of energy and the ability for us locally to produce some of that energy renewable is something that if you pay attention to, it becomes pretty interesting and pretty compelling. So as you follow this story, I just would suggest to you to think about that. And if you want to write your congressman or talk to somebody at MLG&W, some pretty interesting conversations can happen. I see this other there's a comment from Rick that I think we need to circle back on because it encompasses all of these scales. And then there's another food production question from Elizabeth. And I will say, if you hang tight, I promise we will get there and we will answer that question. Dave, you want to keep rolling?
No, yeah, I was going to say the same thing. Peggy has a question about the percentage of carbon-free in 2007 in order to relate to the growth of,
that's
I'm
the
not
problem,
sure. Yeah.
right? There's got to be some sort of weird asymptote sort of relationship there where TVA is getting to the point where they're saying, okay, well, we still have to leave these gas and coal plants online to a certain point. I'll also say that even the MISO folks, when they're talking about Memphis, since a lot of it has to get delivered here by transmission in a different way than MLGNW is delivering, they're both saying that we're going to need to generate some of our own energy here. And even then, the answer is a very efficient, albeit, but still the answer for either one of these contracts is a natural gas fired plant. So the other problem about this is whatever deal we negotiate, if we go with the MISO folks, even though we might be saving money, they're going to bring a whole new plant online who's reliant upon fossil fuels, which it's not great. It's not great.
Yeah, when there's a lot of, and there's a lot of potential for a local generation, if we would be creative about it. And also TVA, there's an issue with TVA and their ability to, well, in the current contract, basically you can't generate your own electricity and sell it back to the grid. So it's really disincentivizes creating your own solar power locally, at your house, for instance. So yeah, there's a lot going on there, which is very complex, but super important. So be part of the conversation, I guess, is our answer, our message. In Memphis, there's a whole host of local things that we can think about. Memphis 3.0 is this new plan that was being rolled out before the pandemic, and I guess continues to be so. That tries to address some of these things. Some of the issues that come into play are transportation. The Metropolitan Area Transit, or the Memphis Area Transit Authority, MATA. There's a big conversation about how do we fund MATA? How much can we fund MATA? Which relates to equity, but also to environmental issues, water issues, simple household things, but also larger commercial issues around recycling and composting and food waste. In fact, Memphis, and I just learned of this a couple of weeks ago, is there's going to be a public composting facility that's coming online fairly soon, and I think my family and I are going to visit it this week. So there's some movement around composting, for instance. And it's surprising how much local issues around composting and food waste. There's actually a fairly big carbon footprint surrounding how we, certainly how we produce our food, and then what we do with the food that doesn't get used. And then, that's super interesting and actually really important. There's things around local businesses, right? So supporting locally produced food that's resilient, models of food production and delivery that are more resilient and tend to be more environmentally friendly. Project Green Fork, which works with restaurants, community-supported agricultures. There's a local organization called the Compost Ferry, which makes composting much more accessible to a lot of people. Somebody mentioned density and neighborhood plans. This is actually in Matt's bailiwick. And I've learned a lot from him around how important urban planning is to the carbon footprint of a city. And some cities are better at thinking about these than others, but we have a lot of growth happening, or at least we did before the pandemic. And so there's a lot of potential to, to think hard about the environmental choice, the environmental impact of the choices we're making, and in particular around carbon footprint. Do you want to add anything to this, Matt?
Yeah, I think if we move to the next slide, I can sort of bridge between those things, because Micah has a lot to do with this. In Memphis and proper, the things that I think are really interesting, and we see stories all the time about real estate. We see stories all the time about our public education system. We see issues related to water quality and industry and recruitment of new businesses to town, and then things like planning and MATA and things like that. I would suggest to you that if you take the approach that all of those things are interrelated, and that really what we're trying to do is, if we're able to provide access in an equity level of access to all of our neighborhoods throughout Memphis and Shelby County and the surrounding areas, the level of improvement from an environmental and community standpoint will be magnified. So anything that you can talk about open space, parks, food deserts, access to transport, access to education, access to healthcare, any of these things that we're talking about, when you can improve the entire community watersheds, access to these things, and keep in mind things like fossil fuels when you're doing it, even when you're not talking about fossil fuels, when you're talking about density and when you're talking about equity and making sure that the folks in Fraser and the folks in Westwood have the same thing that the folks in Colonial Acres or Central Gardens or Valentine and Evergreen have, you're talking about social justice, but you're also talking about climate benefiting institutions, okay? Because if we can keep everybody in their neighborhood and keep their neighborhood more sustainable, then they won't need to drive a car somewhere to get access to good healthcare or education. And when they do that, they can strengthen their own community, and then their community can become less reliant upon fossil fuels to exist. It's really, really straightforward, as long as you start to understand everything as being connected, and almost we as a town breathe together and live together. And so we have this up here because we understand Micah has really, really been great about understanding that interconnected behavior between not only faith organizations, but things like transport, access, open space, healthcare, education, et cetera. Dave?
Yeah, and I was just going to add that it also makes these communities more resilient, which moving forward, we are experiencing climate change. And so we're going to have to, as communities, deal with the effects of what we've done. And so that resiliency, as we build communities and make societies more, communities and our society as a whole more equitable and more, take care of each other better, then we'll be better able to handle these crises that are facing us. I think the kind of one thing to say here as we go through all of these is, the important point is you don't have to work on all of these levels. You don't have to work on all of these things. Do something at each level, what works for you. You might find you start doing the other things too. So don't, all of these things that we're suggesting, you don't have to do it all at once. Just pick something and prayerfully, right? So I guess I'll just mention briefly, so Calvary there's an Episcopal priest, Fletcher Harper. He heads an organization called Green Faith, which is an interfaith organization working towards environmental sustainability and resilience. And he was supposed to come to Calvary and to our Lenten preaching series this year, but instead he gave a podcast, which I would really commend to you. He talks about having communal, local conversations around resiliency and environmental justice. And I think it's a really inspiring message, and I think a good way for religious communities to move forward in talking and thinking about these issues. So I would commend this podcast episode to you, which can be found on the Calvary Memphis podcast feed. This is maybe sort of I think may spur some of you to action as well. It certainly has me. This goes to Elizabeth's question from a couple slides ago. And Matt actually found this slide. This is a slide that shows, thinking again about food and how central that is to our lives, and how actually the food production and the food consumption and the food waste and the food transport, food packaging, all of these things go into the carbon footprint. And when you look in detail at all of these things, it's really amazing. It's amazing that it happens, and it's amazing to think about all the steps that go into it, but also the impact that this food production has. And so basically, this is a bar chart that shows the units are the greenhouse gas emissions per kilogram of food product in kilograms of CO2 equivalents. So essentially what that means is you could think of it as kilograms of carbon dioxide emitted to produce a kilogram of food, of whatever this food is. And you notice that beef produces 60 kilograms of carbon dioxide and releases that into the atmosphere just to get 1 kilogram of beef. And a lot of that actually comes from, so this is a case where, it's, the fossil fuel connection is a little, it's not perfect here. So this is one case where that connection is not quite as strong, because a lot of that actually comes from methane production through land use and from cows. So cows produce methane. And there's a lot of other things that go into this too. But you'll notice that a lot of these things that are at the top, beef, lamb and mutton, cheese, are things that, Americans consume a lot of. And a lot of the things that are lower down are more plant-centric. So I know as I've sort of sat with this over quite a long period of time, I'm starting to realize that this is, it's a very personal way to connect to, how we're impacting the greenhouse gas content of the atmosphere. And so it's actually made me start to make different choices personally.
David, would there be an opportunity to get a copy of that exhibit?
We can try to do that, yeah. Sarah, I'm sure there's a way that we can share some of the things in this presentation with you all.
Thank you.
You can take a screenshot page and then you can print it later.
Oh, thank you.
We're happy to send.
If you have a PDF,
yeah.
Would you send that to presentation? That would be a lot better.
Yeah, I'd be happy to do
Right.
that.
Great, thank you.
So this is, there's a lot of things I love there. Dairy, chocolate, coffee. So I won't claim any sort of purity on this. If we're thinking about how, if we're thinking about righteousness in terms of how much carbon emissions I'm putting into the atmosphere, I certainly can't claim any special status. But it's definitely made thinking about things like this have changed some of my choices, and I hope that they will continue to do so. I'll mention just briefly. This is a book I read this spring by an author, and he was supposed to be coming to Rose to talk about this in the fall. He'll actually be giving a virtual presentation on September 10. But this is an accessible and literary book that focuses less on the data and more on his personal experiences and sort of an interesting framework that I think some of you might find helpful. So I would commend this relatively short book to you. But there are plenty of other resources to think about these issues with. Did you want to add anything to this, Matt?
No, I think we can keep going. I think just to remind sort of the overall arc of this thing for all of us is, and what Dave and I have come to to really understand through talking about this with so many people is you don't have to, there are so many things that you can do at so many levels. We've just talked today about the national level, the state level, the regional level, the Memphis level, the community level, and then there's your household level, and then there's your personal level. At all of those scales, if you choose to do anything, I think all we're trying to advocate is you don't have to become some sort of strange abbot or friar or have some sort of intensively ascetic practice associated with these things. What we find has been really, really satisfying is making choices and understanding that every time you make this choice, it's sort of like a little prayer for the environment. You know, like when you recycle, it's not about recycling something because you feel good, or when you ride a bike versus taking a car, or when you take a bus rather than doing something else or taking a walk. Don't just think about it as I'm trying to do my part to save the environment. It helps. It's great. You know, it's great for us to talk about our aquifer. What's really, really important is that if you can make these choices and sort of tie them into your spiritual well-being and say, when I recycle, it's a prayer. If I compost, it's a prayer. If I go to the farmer's market and I tell someone how much I love the soap that I get or the collard greens that I'm making for dinner, and when I pray about those things before I eat them, you understand that these things are all connected. It not only helps you from this anxiety about we're killing the planet while we're doing all these things, it also helps you tie an everyday behavior, whether it's voting or eating or transport or anything else, to a sort of spiritual vocation. And so we encourage you to find the things that make you feel more whole, and understand that if you can tie yourself into this larger sort of spiritual understanding, I promise it makes you feel better. And it makes you feel happier, and it's more of a joyful thing than relative to something else. So that's really what we want to encourage everyone to do. And it's meant a lot to us personally in talking through people and saying, if you want to force yourself to do something, fine, but if there's a way in which you can find more wholeness in it, you know, we encourage that. For sure. I don't know, Dave, if we I don't know where we are in time, and I don't know on anything else, but I did want to talk about Rick's question. If anybody else has questions, or if we have other slides, let's go ahead and get to them. I forget, is this the last slide, or we have one more? Oh, 5 minutes. Thanks, Sarah. The question about Rick's question about there's a concern within the world of pandemia about density, and how density may have fostered contagion in places, and that there's a sort of an argument that you might need to be in less dense environments to be more resilient. I can tell you two big things. In places like London, New York, and I'm going to say someplace like Paris or Rome right now, you're not hearing a lot about what's going on in those dense environments in terms of the pandemic, because we're busy worrying about Mississippi. Okay? I can argue that Mississippi is significantly less dense than New York City. So although there were some people saying because of density we have this issue, I would argue that there are other issues that complicate that, and just talking about density is not the only measure of resilience. The second thing is that I would argue that Memphis and Shelby County, the density that they're talking about, we're going to have to work really, really hard for the next 50 years to even approach the levels of density that might concern someone in that argument. Okay, when you're talking about metropolitan areas like New York, Chicago, Houston, we're not even close. So the more dense we become in the very short to long term in Memphis, I can argue will have far greater positive impact on our culture and on our economic well-being. So the Memphis 3.0 and other things like that, the more dense that we can become, I can honestly say that in the short term, we got a lot of work to do before we're concerned about those other issues.
Good question. Are there other questions or thoughts or?
I have one. Dave and Matt, thank you for leading this conversation today. And thank you for leading us through some of these things that we can do on our local level, maybe in our congregation and personally as well. I was in a conversation recently with someone who started from essentially, I think, the same point that I did, that curbing carbon emissions is important, but this person reached a different conclusion than I did about what we could do about it. And essentially threw their arms up in the air and said, well, there's not a whole lot we can do other than act politically and act to vote. So all these little things that Jeremy, you're mentioning that we could do, ultimately they don't matter. It's the voting, it's the political action is the only thing that's going to make this change happen. How would you gentlemen respond to that from someone who, again, starts from basically the same place I think we all do on this issue?
Dave, can I just jump on a Cheeto?
Sure.
So in America, if you want to think about it this way, when you buy something, you vote for it. Okay, so you can talk about the ballot box, and the ballot box comes around every once in a while. But if anything about cancel culture has given us a window into things, it's this: you can relate where you put your money. And so I would argue politics is very important, and it's important for us to understand that these environmental issues shouldn't be partisan issues, but also should be policy issues. But policy is sort of infrastructural. It creates the loopholes that business goes around, okay? And the way business is sustained is through the economy. And it goes back to the comment that Peggy was asking earlier. The way I can make more sustainable houses is I need more people coming to my office and saying, I want a sustainable house, and I'm happy to pay 5% more to see 15% more. So I would say you can't throw up your hands and say you can vote. I think that's really, really important. But understand, every time you buy something, if it ships to you, you made a vote to buy jet fuel. If you drove to your farmer's market, you made a vote to not pay for jet fuel, whatever else. So I guess all I would say is that realize that everything that you do and every purchase that you make is a vote for something, if you want to think about it that way.
And maybe just to add to that, I mean, I think that's a really important thing to think about. I don't know whether this person you were talking about is a person of faith, but, as Matt was talking and as I was thinking about an answer, I was thinking about, this is Sunday school. I was thinking about Jesus and his example. He was a political figure, right? But he didn't come and create a political revolution. He came and was talking about the kingdom of God, which is both smaller and bigger than politics. I'm a firm believer, and I really am a very strong believer in good, sensible public policy and the immense impact that can have. But I think, I guess as a Christian, it seems clear to me that there's more to life than that, and that God doesn't call us just to be political creatures, to solve all our problems through social policy. So I think this is a big enough and complex enough problem that we have to find all the ways that we can to work on it. And honestly, our politics, part of the issue right now is our breakdown of communities and relationships. So starting there is maybe a way into the politics. I hope that helps. Some thoughts.
Dave and Matt, I think that's a great place to end today. Thank you both so much for being with us. This has been really enriching. I'm grateful to everybody on this call. There was, I feel like we've really figured out how to do Zoom. There was a lot of back and forth here in a way that felt really natural, and like we might even be sitting just in a room together. So thank you all for being here. We we're very intentional at Idlewild about calling our Sunday school and really all of our opportunities for learning Christian formation rather than Christian education, which might not be the fairest definition for education, David. But the distinction that we draw there is that we're not just coming here to consume more information, but we gather to be formed as disciples of Jesus Christ. So you've not only formed us in the information that you've shared today, but also just in your testimony. So thank you so much. This has been really enriching, informative. Y'all, I gotta go to worship, so I'm gonna sign us off, but hopefully I'll see you there. All right.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, everybody.
Have a good day.
All right.